best performer, probably Elvis Presley. I don't think anybody could touch him. I never saw Hank Williams, who was one of my favorites.
Johnny Cash wrote about Elvis Presley the way only someone who truly knew him could. Not with reverence, not with careful managed tribute, with honesty. He said what he liked, what he preferred, what he missed, and what the loss of that 19-year-old kid from Memphis actually meant to a man who had been standing in the same room when it all began. Tonight, we go through what Cash actually wrote and what it reveals about the man behind the legend that nobody else came close to saying. The kid on the flatbed truck. The first time Johnny Cash saw Elvis Presley perform, it was not a concert. It was not a television appearance. It was not even a proper stage. It was a flatbed truck. Sometime in 1954, a young man with one single to his name stood on the back of a truck parked outside a Cat's drugstore on Lamar Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee, and sang his two songs to a crowd of 200 or 300 people, mostly teenage girls who had turned out specifically to see him. He had only two songs to offer. He sang them over and over on a loop because there was nothing else yet to sing. Johnny Cash was in that crowd. He and his then-wife Vivian had heard about this young performer and come out to see what all the noise was about. What Cash witnessed that afternoon on Lamar Avenue struck him enough that he remembered it specifically and in detail decades later when he finally committed the memory to his autobiography. A kid with one record and a flatbed truck for a stage, already commanding the attention of hundreds of people through nothing more than pure, unmediated presence. After the performance, Cash and Vivian went up to introduce themselves. Presley invited them to his next show, scheduled for that same evening at a club called the Eagle's Nest, a venue promoted by a disc jockey named Sleepy-Eyed John, who had played an important role in getting Sun Records music out to Memphis audiences alongside the more famous Dewey Phillips. The Eagle's Nest show turned out to be, in Cash's own later description, a blunder of scheduling. The club was an adult venue where teenagers were not particularly welcome, and so Cash and Vivian found themselves among only about a dozen patrons on a night when the crowd should have been considerably larger. It did not matter. Cash was already paying close attention. What he noticed that night, and what he specifically preserved in his account years later, was not primarily what most people focused on when they discussed Elvis Presley. It was not the voice, though the voice was obviously present and remarkable. It was not the physical performance, though the physical performance had already caused enough public controversy to establish Presley's national reputation before he had barely begun. What Cash noticed and specifically remembered across the following decades was Elvis Presley's guitar playing. He described Presley as a fabulous rhythm player, an assessment that surprised many people who encountered it decades later, since Presley's guitar playing was rarely discussed or celebrated in the way his voice and stage presence consistently were. Cash recalled that Presley would start into his early songs with his own guitar alone, and the sound of that opening rhythm was enough, before anyone else joined in, to hold complete attention. He recalled being almost disappointed when Scotty Moore and Bill Black joined in to complete the trio, not because Moore and Black were anything other than perfect for the sound they created together, but because those first few seconds of Presley alone with his guitar had produced something Cash found genuinely, specifically arresting in a way the fuller trio sound partially obscured. This kind of precise, honest musical observation from someone with Cash's own considerable musical expertise represents something considerably more valuable than simple celebrity admiration. Cash was not describing what he believed he was supposed to think about Elvis Presley. He was describing what he had actually heard and what it had specifically done to him as a musician listening to another musician, a qualitatively different kind of testimony. The two men talked that night at the Eagle's Nest, though Cash noted carefully in his autobiography that he never spoke to Presley about Sun Records or any other connection into the music business. He was determined to find his own path independently, and apparently Presley respected this without pressing the matter further. What they did talk about was music, the subject that naturally bound together every musician who moved through Memphis's specific, unusually fertile creative environment during this particular period. This first meeting placed Cash and Presley at the very beginning of both their careers, each of them still finding their footing within the world Sam Phillips had helped create at Sun Studios. Cash's own first single would not appear until later that same year. Presley's debut was so recent that he still had only two songs to offer a crowd, They were, at this precise moment, simply two young men from poor Southern backgrounds who had each found their way to Memphis and to music, with no clear sense yet of exactly how far either of their paths would eventually take them. That path would bring them together again, months later, in a moment that would become one of the most celebrated and most discussed episodes in the entire history of American popular music. Four young men from Sun Records gathered by chance in a single studio on a December afternoon in 1956, jamming through gospel songs and early rock and roll in a session nobody planned and everybody present remembered for the rest of their lives. The $1 Million Quartet: Elvis, Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis. Sam Phillips left the tapes running. The recordings survived. They have been studied, celebrated, and debated ever since as a document of a specific, unrepeatable moment when several of the most significant figures in American music history happened to occupy the same room at the same time, long before any of them fully grasped what that room would eventually come to represent. Cash was there. He remembered it the same way he remembered the flatbed truck on Lamar Avenue. Not as legend, not as mythology, but as a specific particular afternoon with specific sounds and specific people that happened to turn out to matter considerably more than anyone present that day realized at the time. My Elvis was the Elvis of the 50s. Johnny Cash was not the kind of man who softened his opinions to protect comfortable narratives. Throughout his life, he said what he thought, even about people he genuinely loved and admired, even when what he thought complicated the simpler, more reverent version of a story the public preferred. His reflections on Elvis Presley, accumulated across decades of interviews and eventually committed to his autobiography, reflect exactly this quality. He admired Presley genuinely and deeply, from the moment he watched him command a crowd from a flatbed truck in 1954. He also had specific clear-eyed opinions about what Presley had become over the following 2 decades, opinions that he expressed with the same direct, unvarnished honesty he applied to every other subject he addressed publicly. The central, most quoted statement Cash made about Presley in his autobiography draws a sharp, deliberate line between 2 distinct versions of the same man. My Elvis was the Elvis of the 50s, Cash wrote. He was a kid when I worked with him. He was 19 years old, and he loved cheeseburgers, girls, and his mother, not necessarily in that order. It was more like his mother, then girls, then cheeseburgers. This sentence has become one of the most frequently cited descriptions of Presley from any of his contemporaries, partly because of its specific affectionate detail, and partly because of what it implicitly acknowledges alongside that affection. The phrase "My Elvis" creates a direct, unambiguous contrast with the Elvis that most of the world came to know across the following 2 decades of film work, Las Vegas residencies, and declining health. Cash was explicitly claiming a specific earlier version of Presley as the one that mattered most to him personally, the 19-year-old who loved cheeseburgers and his mother, rather than the global superstar who eventually disappeared beneath the weight of his own image. Cash continued this assessment with an opinion about Presley's music that was, coming from someone of his stature and personal acquaintance, considerably more critical than most public tributes to Presley allowed. He wrote that he much preferred Presley's music from when they had first met over the popular later work, which Cash described as overproduced. He had loved the sound he encountered at the Eagle's Nest in 1954, Presley alone with his guitar before the rest of the trio joined in. The raw, spare, specific quality of very early Sun Records Presley, and had found the orchestrated, studio-polished productions that defined much of his subsequent career a substantial departure from what had made that original sound so arresting. This kind of direct, honest musical criticism, offered not by a detractor but by someone who had personally witnessed and genuinely admired Presley's earliest work, represents something considerably more interesting than simple nostalgia. Cash was making a specific aesthetic argument rooted in direct personal experience, claiming that the commercial and artistic choices of Presley's subsequent career had moved him away from the very qualities that had originally made him extraordinary, rather than simply representing a natural evolution or growth. This opinion carried particular weight because of who Cash himself was as an artist. He had navigated his own complicated relationship with commercial pressure and artistic authenticity across decades of a career that included genuine commercial success alongside sustained creative independence. He understood, from personal experience, exactly what the pull toward commercial production values felt like, and exactly what was lost or gained by different choices along that spectrum. His preference for the raw early Presley over the overproduced later versions was not simply sentimental longing for youth. It was a considered aesthetic judgment from someone who had grappled with the same essential tension in his own work. Cash also observed, with the same characteristic directness, something about Presley's guitar, playing specifically that nobody else seemed to notice or celebrate. He had been genuinely impressed by what he heard at the Eagle's Nest in 1954, Presley's rhythm playing, standing out as something specifically remarkable that subsequently disappeared almost entirely from his recorded work. Cash noted that he never heard anyone else praise Presley's playing in the way he himself had been struck by it that night, and that he could not recall ever hearing it featured prominently on any of Presley's subsequent records. This detail, the genuine musical ability that public fame had obscured rather than showcased, connected directly to Cash's broader feeling that Presley's commercial trajectory had in some ways moved away from, rather than toward, his actual strengths. Despite these honest, sometimes critical assessments, Cash's overall account of Presley in his autobiography carried genuine warmth and affection throughout. He was not attempting to diminish Presley or revise the scale of his achievement. He was doing something considerably rarer and more valuable. He was describing the actual person he had known, in the specific detail that genuine personal acquaintance makes possible, rather than contributing to the mythology that had accumulated around a name and image so famous they had long since become largely disconnected from any individual human reality. He also acknowledged, with equal honesty, the sadness embedded in watching someone he had known, in that raw, early form, become something so thoroughly different across the following years. The cheeseburger-loving 19-year-old from Memphis and the rhinestone-suited Las Vegas performer were, in Cash's personal experience, difficult to fully connect as the same person, not because the later Presley was somehow false, but because the specific qualities Cash had found most arresting at the Eagle's Nest in 1954 had been, in his honest assessment, gradually covered over rather than developed. When August of 1977 arrived, what Cash lost was not simply a fellow star or a peer from the early Sun Records days. He lost the last living connection to that specific, irreplaceable moment in Memphis, 1954, when two young men from poor Southern backgrounds had talked about music in an adult club with barely a dozen people in the room, neither of them yet imagining how far the road ahead actually ran. The day the news came. August the 16th, 1977. Johnny Cash was 45 years old, in the middle of his own complicated, ongoing struggle with the same kinds of personal demons that had quietly consumed Elvis Presley across the preceding decade. Cash had battled addiction to amphetamines throughout much of the 1960s, a struggle that had become publicly known and that had nearly destroyed his career and personal life before he managed, with considerable difficulty and the sustained support of June Carter Cash, to achieve a measure of sobriety that allowed him to rebuild both. By 1977, he had maintained that recovery for several years, though the battle was never entirely over, and the particular pressures of sustained fame and constant performance that had contributed to his earlier difficulties remained present in his daily life. The news of Elvis Presley's death arrived, as it arrived for virtually everyone that afternoon, with the sudden, disorienting quality of information too large and too unexpected to process immediately. Cash had known, in the way that anyone paying attention to Presley's public appearances during this period knew, that his old friend and fellow Sun Records alumnus was not well. The physical decline visible in photographs and concert footage from Presley's final years had been impossible to miss for anyone who remembered what he had looked like in 1954. But knowing someone is struggling is not the same as being prepared for the specific moment when the struggle ends. Cash learned of Presley's death while on the road, the default condition of his professional life throughout virtually his entire career. He processed the news in the particular, complicated way of someone who had lost not just a peer or a professional acquaintance, but a specific, irreplaceable connection to the most formative period of his own life: the Eagle's Nest in Memphis, the flatbed truck on Lamar Avenue, the $1 million Quartet session at Sun Studios in December of 1956, 4 young men from similar backgrounds singing gospel songs together in a room that neither they nor anyone else fully understood, yet would eventually mean so much to so many people. That last connection carried particular weight. The $1 Million Quartet session had included 4 men. By August of 1977, one of them was gone. Cash, Carl Perkins, and Jerry Lee Lewis were the 3 who remained, each of them now carrying a specific personal memory of that December afternoon that the world had come to treat as historical, but that each of them had experienced simply as an ordinary Tuesday in a recording studio, doing what they did every day, with a friend who happened to stop by. Cash's response to Presley's death did not take the form of immediate public tribute in the days immediately following the news. He was not among the figures who rushed to microphones or cameras to offer carefully worded statements about legacy and loss in the immediate chaotic aftermath of August the 16th. This restraint was consistent with how Cash typically processed significant personal events, generally preferring to sit with grief privately before finding the specific words or actions that felt genuinely adequate to what he was actually feeling. He had also, by this point in his own life, developed a complex and specifically personal understanding of exactly what addiction could do to a person, what it looked like from the inside and from the outside, and what it took from the people it consumed. His own years of amphetamine addiction had given him a framework for understanding Presley's decline that went beyond what a casual observer could access. He was not simply watching a famous contemporary deteriorate publicly. He was watching someone he had known personally go through a version of a process he himself had survived, with a different outcome. This particular kind of grief, losing someone to something you have personally survived, carries a specific weight that is difficult to articulate and easy to misread from outside. It is neither simple sadness nor simple survivor's guilt. It is a complicated mixture of genuine mourning for the specific person lost, complicated awareness of exactly how the process works and what it demands, and some private reckoning with the specific combination of circumstances, choices, and luck that produce different outcomes for different people facing similar situations. Cash never made this dimension of his response to Presley's death explicit in any of his public statements or published writing, but the specific context of his own history with addiction, combined with his personal knowledge of Presley dating back to 1954, gives his eventual public tribute that December, and his written reflections on Presley's life and death in his autobiography. A layer of understanding and complexity that simple biographical proximity alone could not fully explain. By the time December arrived, Cash was ready to say something publicly about what Presley's death had meant to him. The occasion he chose was not a press conference or a magazine interview. It was a television Christmas special, a format that had its own particular emotional register, intimate and performative simultaneously, that suited the complicated mixture of grief and celebration he apparently felt was the most honest available response to the loss of the man he had first watched perform from the back of a flatbed truck 23 years earlier. What he said that December, and how he chose to say it alongside the 2 remaining members of the $1 Million Quartet, would become one of the most quietly significant public tributes anyone offered to Elvis Presley in the immediate aftermath of his death. This train is bound for glory. December of 1977. Johnny Cash stood on a television stage for his annual Christmas special 4 months after Elvis Presley's death. Beside him stood Carl Perkins and Jerry Lee Lewis, the 2 surviving members of the $1 Million Quartet. Roy Orbison, another Sun Records alumnus who had not been present at the original 1956 session, but who shared the same foundational Memphis roots, joined them as well. The 4 men had gathered to do something that none of them had fully anticipated needing to do so soon, to mark, publicly and on camera, the absence of someone who should have been standing among them. Cash set up the tribute with characteristic simplicity, avoiding the kind of elaborate, carefully crafted statement that public occasions typically demand from famous people asked to speak about famous losses. He spoke directly, without apparent preparation or performance, in the same plain, unvarnished register that defined his best work across every format he ever worked in. He told the audience he had worked his very first concert as a guest, and that Elvis had been the star. Cash noted that Elvis always was a star because all of them remembered him and how he loved gospel songs and how they liked him. "This song," he said simply, "is for Elvis." The group then performed the gospel standard, "This Train is Bound for Glory," a choice that revealed something significant about how Cash specifically understood and chose to honor Presley's memory in that specific moment. He did not choose one of Presley's hit records, the songs that had defined his commercial legacy and filled arenas across 2 decades of extraordinary fame. He chose a gospel song rooted in exactly the same tradition that had shaped both men since childhood, the same tradition that had filled the Sun Studios session room in December of 1956, when 4 young men had spent most of an impromptu jam session singing hymns and gospel standards rather than the rock and roll songs that would eventually make them famous. This choice connected directly back to what Cash had written and said consistently about Presley across his entire adult life. His Elvis was the 19-year-old who had grown up in the same Pentecostal gospel tradition that had shaped Cash's own earliest musical formation. The cheeseburger-loving kid from Tupelo who had told Cash about a musician named Johnny Cash before Cash himself had become famous enough for anyone else to tell that story. The boy at the Eagle's Nest who had played rhythm guitar alone before the rest of the trio joined in. The sound Cash had specifically and precisely recalled across 23 years because it had genuinely, immediately, specifically impressed him. A gospel song for Elvis was not a statement about his religious beliefs or a eulogy in the conventional sense. It was a return to origin, a reaching back past the rhinestones and the Las Vegas showrooms, and the overproduction Cash had honestly admitted, preferring less, all the way back to the foundation that both men shared, the church music of poor Southern childhoods that had given them each their deepest musical instincts, before they had any idea those instincts would eventually carry them anywhere. Carl Perkins performed 3 of Presley's songs during the same special, a more conventional tribute format that acknowledged the commercial catalog of hits that defined Presley's public legacy. Cash and Perkins together performed Blue Christmas, the holiday standard Presley had popularized in 1957. The special also included other musical tributes connecting back to the Sun Records era that all 4 men present that evening shared. But it was the moment Cash specifically set up the gospel performance, speaking plainly about a first concert and a star who always was a star that carried the most personal weight. The words were not elaborate or poetic. They were the words of someone who had actually been there, at the very beginning, watching a 19-year-old kid with 1 record and a flatbed truck for a stage, and who had known, even then, that he was watching something worth remembering. The television audience watching that December special in 1977 encountered Cash's tribute within the broader context of 4 months of public mourning for Presley. 4 months of newspaper tributes, magazine retrospectives, documentary specials, and the ongoing public debate about his cause of death and the circumstances surrounding it. Within that crowded field of public response, Cash's contribution stood out specifically because of its restraint, its personal specificity, and its deliberate return to the gospel roots both men shared. He did not attempt to summarize Presley's career or legacy. He did not address the controversies surrounding his death or the complicated questions about medication and decline that had dominated much of the public conversation since August. He simply acknowledged a star, recalled a connection, and sang a gospel song. This restraint reflected something important about Cash's broader relationship to Presley's memory across the following years. He never became a prominent public commentator on Presley's legacy in the way some other contemporaries did, never wrote extended tribute pieces or participated in major documentary retrospectives, addressing Presley's significance to American culture. He processed his grief and his memories the way he processed most significant personal experiences, privately first and eventually through his own writing, in his own time, in his own words. The autobiography that would eventually contain his most complete, most honest reflections on Presley, including the cheeseburger quote, the overproduction criticism, and the specific musical observation about rhythm guitar playing nobody else had noticed, would not appear until 1997, 20 years after the Christmas special and 2 decades after the flatbed truck on Lamar Avenue. What he had said on that December stage, simply and directly, turned out to be both the first and the most immediate version of something he would spend the following 2 decades finding the complete words for. What he finally wrote down, Johnny Cash's autobiography, published in 1997 under the simple title Cash, arrived 20 years after Elvis Presley's death and 6 years before Cash's own death in September of 2003. By the time he sat down to write it, he had spent 2 decades carrying his memories of Presley privately, processing them the way he processed most things of genuine personal significance, slowly, honestly, and without particular urgency to share them with an audience that hadn't specifically asked. The book itself reflected Cash's characteristic approach to self-examination: direct, sometimes brutally honest about his own failures and weaknesses, resistant to the kind of carefully managed, reputation-protective self-presentation that most celebrity memoirs default toward. He wrote about his addiction with unflinching candor. He wrote about his marriages, his faith, his artistic choices, and his professional relationships with the same quality of honest, unvarnished reflection that had defined his best work on record for 4 decades. His sections addressing Presley carried this same quality, and it is specifically this quality that makes them worth examining carefully alongside everything else said and written about Presley by people who knew him during the Sun Records years. Cash was not trying to protect Presley's image posthumously, or to contribute to the mythology that had accumulated around his name across the 20 years since his death. He was simply describing what he had personally experienced, what he had personally noticed, and what he personally felt about the loss. The cheeseburger passage, describing Presley's loves in order as his mother, then girls, then cheeseburgers, represents Cash at his most affectionately specific. It is the kind of detail that can only come from actual personal knowledge, a small, particular, entirely human observation about someone's actual daily preferences that cuts straight through the accumulated layers of mythology to something recognizably real. This was not the king of rock and roll. This was a 19-year-old kid from Mississippi who had priorities Cash found both relatable and genuinely endearing. Cash also wrote, with the same personal specificity, about Presley's sensitivity, his vulnerability to the gossip and rumors that had followed him even in the very earliest days of his career, before the full weight of extraordinary fame had fully settled onto him. He was very sensitive, Cash wrote, easily hurt by the stories people told about him. This observation, made about the very earliest period of Presley's public life, carries considerable retrospective weight when placed against everything known about how Presley responded to scrutiny and criticism across his later years. The growing paranoia, the isolation, the increasingly painful gap between public image and private experience. The sensitivity Cash noticed in 1954 never disappeared. It simply had considerably more to absorb as the decades progressed. The criticism Cash offered about Presley's later work, particularly his preference for the raw early recordings over the overproduced later productions, represented something he appeared to have thought about carefully, rather than arrived at impulsively. He had spent his own career navigating the same essential tension between commercial production values and the raw, spare sound he had first fallen in love with at the Eagle's Nest. His preference for early Presley was not nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. It was an informed artistic judgment rooted in direct personal experience of exactly what had been lost in the transition from Sun Studios' simplicity to elaborate orchestrated arrangements. Cash was also characteristically honest about the distance that had developed between himself and Presley across the years, separating their Sun Records beginnings from their respective later careers. They had not been close friends in any sustained, ongoing sense throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The way they had been young contemporaries moving through the same small creative world in the mid-1950s. Fame had taken each of them in very different directions, both professionally and personally, and the specific, unrepeatable quality of their earliest connection had never quite been replicated in the contexts their later careers provided. This honesty about distance mattered specifically to understanding how Cash experienced Presley's death. He was not grieving a current, active friendship that had been suddenly severed. He was grieving something older and, in some ways, more fundamental. A specific period of his own life. A specific version of both men that had existed briefly, brilliantly, and unrepeatable in Memphis in the mid-1950s, before fame had transformed each of them in ways neither could have fully anticipated from the vantage point of a flatbed truck on Lamar Avenue or a near-empty adult club on a Tuesday night. Cash's own ongoing struggle with addiction through 1977 added a specific, rarely acknowledged layer to how he processed Presley's death privately. He understood, from the inside, exactly what the combination of prescription medication and sustained performance pressure could do to a person across a decade of accumulating use. He had been through his own version of something similar. He had, through a combination of willingness to change and June Carter Cash's sustained, determined love, found a path through that particular darkness that Presley had not. This awareness never became explicit in Cash's published writing about Presley, but it informed the specific texture of his reflections throughout his autobiography in ways that careful readers have noted across the years since its publication. What Cash ultimately left behind in his autobiography's sections addressing Presley was not a comprehensive biography or a cultural analysis of Presley's significance to American music. It was something smaller and considerably more valuable. A first-hand account of one specific particular friendship, remembered honestly and completely, with equal space given to what he admired, what he preferred, what he noticed that nobody else seemed to notice, and what it meant to watch someone he had known at 19 years old eventually disappear beneath the weight of everything that 19-year-old had eventually become. Two men from the same world. Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley came from the same place, in every sense that actually matters. Same era, same geography, same poverty, same gospel music absorbed in childhood churches before either of them had any idea that music might eventually become something more than Sunday worship and community gathering. Same Sam Phillips, the same Sun Studios, the same specific unrepeatable Memphis creative environment of the mid-1950s that produced more significant American musical figures within a single decade than almost any other time and place in the country's cultural history. They also ended up, by the time of Presley's death in 1977, in very different places. Not geographically and not commercially, both had achieved extraordinary, sustained success by any reasonable measure. But in terms of what their respective careers had done to them personally, in terms of how each man had navigated the specific enormous pressures that extraordinary fame imposes on ordinary human beings, from ordinary backgrounds who were never fully prepared for what was coming, the distance between them was considerable and, in retrospect, genuinely instructive. Cash had nearly destroyed himself with amphetamines during the 1960s, had come close enough to the edge that the outcome could easily have been very different, and had found his way back through a combination of personal will, the specific love of June Carter Cash, and a willingness to acknowledge that he needed help, that Presley, by most accounts available, never quite managed to fully sustain across his own difficult final decade. This is not a judgment about character or strength. Addiction is not a moral failing, and the specific circumstances surrounding each man's relationship with prescription medication and performance pressure were different enough that simple comparison risks missing the genuine complexity of each individual situation. What Cash's survival and Presley's death does illustrate, placed together against the shared background of their origins, is something more structural and more sobering. The same world that produced both of them, the same poverty, the same gospel roots, the same Sam Phillips and Sun Studios and Memphis creative environment, did not provide either of them with any particular preparation for what extraordinary fame would eventually demand. Cash wrote about Presley with honesty, precisely because he understood this shared vulnerability from the inside. He was not a distant observer, commenting on someone else's experience of pressures he had never personally encountered. He was someone who had faced his own version of the same essential challenge, and who knew, specifically and personally, how genuinely difficult that challenge was and how uncertain the outcome. This shared understanding, never made fully explicit in Cash's published writing, but present throughout his reflections on Presley, gives his account a weight and credibility that most other available testimonies about Presley's life and eventual death simply cannot match. He was not assessing Presley from the comfortable distance of someone who had navigated fame more gracefully. He was speaking from the specific hard-won knowledge of someone who had nearly not navigated it at all. What Cash's account ultimately changes about how we understand Elvis Presley is not any single fact or revelation. It is the quality of witness he brings to the broader story, an honest witness who preferred the early work to the later work and said so plainly, who remembered specific small details, the cheeseburgers, the rhythm guitar, the sensitivity easily hurt by gossip, that cut through mythology towards something recognizably human, Who chose a gospel song rather than a hit record when the moment came to say something publicly? Because the gospel roots were what mattered most to both of them from the very beginning. Cash outlived Presley by 26 years, dying in September of 2003, just 4 months after the death of June Carter Cash, in a sequence of losses that those close to him suggested he simply did not have the will to survive independently of her. He spent those 26 years carrying his memories of Elvis Presley the same way he carried most of his significant personal history, privately, honestly, and without particular urgency, to package them into something more comfortable or more flattering than the actual truth. The autobiography he eventually published in 1997 gave those memories their most complete public form. The cheeseburger passage and the overproduction criticism and the rhythm guitar observation existing side by side in a portrait that honored Presley without idealizing him, that grieved him honestly without pretending the grief was simpler or cleaner than it actually was. Two men from the same world, one who found a way through, one who did not. Both of them starting on a flatbed truck on Lamar Avenue in Memphis in 1954. Singing 2 songs on a loop to a crowd of teenagers, with no clear sense yet of where the road ahead would eventually take them. Johnny Cash never wrote a letter to Vernon Presley. What he did was harder and more lasting. He wrote down the truth about a friend he had known since before the world knew either of their names. If this story gave you a fuller picture of 2 men who came from the same place and ended up in very different ones, subscribe for more honest accounts from the people who were actually there at the beginning.